Well, good morning, and as usual, remember, this is the day the Lord's made. We'll rejoice and be glad in it. You know, as I began realizing how close it was to Easter, this year I'd like to share a couple of sermons on the time that Jesus was in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's found in Matthew chapter 26, verse 36 through 49. And we're told there that Jesus came with his disciples to the place called Gethsemane. And he told his disciples, "Sit here while I go and pray over there." And he took with him Peter and the two sons of Zebedee, that's James and John. And he began to be sorrowful and deeply distressed. Matter of fact, other areas in the scripture talks about he sweat as if it was great drops of blood. Then it says that he said to his disciples, matter of fact, to Peter, James, and John. He said, "My soul's exceedingly sorrowful, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little further and fell on his face and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." Then he came to his disciples and found them asleep. And he said to Peter, "What? Couldn't you watch with me for an hour? Watch and pray, lest you enter into temptation. The spirit indeed's willing, but the flesh is weak." Again, a second time, he went away and prayed, saying, "Oh, my Father, if this cup can't pass from me unless I drink it, your will be done." And he came and found them asleep again, for their eyes were heavy. So he left them, went away again, and prayed the third time, saying the same words. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man's being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let's be going. See, my betrayer's at hand." And while he was still speaking, behold, Judas, one of the 12, with a great multitude of swords and clubs, came from the chief priest and the elders of the people. Now his betrayer had given him a sign saying, "Whomever I kiss, he's the one. Seize him." Immediately he went up to Jesus and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. It was a time of decision for Jesus as he prayed there in verses 39 and 42 and 44. 3 times he agonized over what he was about to go through. It was a time of decision for the disciples also, either to follow his command or to fall to the flesh. By the way, it was a time of decision for Judas also, and we know his decision. In this time of decision, which took place there in the Garden of Gethsemane, I want you to notice, first of all, the time was short. The time was short for Jesus. In verse 45 and 46, he said, "Behold, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man's being betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See my betrayer's hand." His 3.5 years of teaching, preaching, ministries coming to an end. What he had come for was at hand. You know, in Luke chapter 19, verse 10, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is come to seek and to save that which is lost." He's coming to the apex of his commission here to the earth. And that is to provide the way by which we who were lost could be saved. The time was short for the disciples also. They thought they had forever. He had told them, but they didn't believe. In verse 2, he says, "You know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." And then in verses 31 through 33, we're told, "Then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it's written, I'll strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I've been raised, I'll go before you in Galilee." Peter answered and said to him, "Even if all are made to stumble because of you, I'll never be made to stumble." How sure he was of himself until he heard that cock crow 3 times. Or twice. Listen, he's told us many times, but people still don't believe. In Luke chapter 21, verses 10 and 11, he said to them, that is, to his disciples, "Nations will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And there'll be great earthquakes in various places and famines and pestilence. And there'll be fearful sights and great signs from heaven." Then in verses 22 through 28, he says, "For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe to those who are pregnant, and to those who are nursing babies in those days, for there'll be great distress in the land." Man, I realize the Bible doesn't even mention the United States, but there's a lot of distress in our land today. But there'll be great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. And they'll fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into nations. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And there'll be signs in the sun, in the moon, in the stars, and on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring, men's hearts failing them from fear and the expectation of those things which are coming on the earth, for the powers of heaven will be shaken. Then they'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. Now when these things begin to happen, look up and lift your heads, because your redemption draws near. Folks, time is short for us today. You know, James chapter 4, verse 14 says, whereas you don't know what'll be happening tomorrow. For what's your life? It's even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. Do what we must today, because Jesus may come tomorrow, or he may come today. Matthew chapter 24, verses 46 through 51. Jesus says, blessed is the servant whom his master, when he comes, will find him so doing. Assuredly, I say to you, he'll make him ruler over all his goods. But if that evil servant says in his heart, my master delays his coming, and begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he's not looking for him, and in an hour that he's not aware of, and he'll come to him. Excuse me. I just got off track there for a second. And he'll come in and cut him in two and appoint him his portion with the hypocrites. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. How sad. I've often said, I had a good friend in Texas, pastored a little church in Dallas called First Baptist Church. His name was W.A. Criswell. I had the privilege of knowing W.A. Criswell for a while and before his passing, and quite a few years before his passing. But anyway, one of the things he told me, he said that he was concerned. His biggest concern is that if the rapture took place today, his congregation would meet the coming Sunday and wonder where in the world he was. Or at least half of his congregation would meet. And I kind of believe that's true of every church, not just his. You see, because Jesus has warned us. And he's told us over and over. But the majority of people don't listen. By the way, let me say this. We have no guarantee of tomorrow. We make all these grandiose plans, but we have no guarantee of tomorrow. Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 20. Jesus says, the ground of a certain rich man, this is a parable that he is telling. He says, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. And he thought to himself, saying, what'll I do since I have no room to store all my crops? So he said, this is what I'll do. I'll pull down my barns and build greater. And there I'll store my crops and my goods. And I'll say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose all these things will be that you provided? Let me say this. It's time of decision. It's time of a decision for you. Where do you stand before God? Are you ready to meet him? Have you done all that he's asked you to do? If not, may I invite you to just come to him and ask him to save your soul. Confess to him that you can't save yourself. and you're going to trust him to save you. And he will. He promises. Well, not only was time short, but also the team was sleeping. You know, in verses 40, 41, 43, and 45, when Jesus came back to him and found him asleep. You see, it was business as usual. In Matthew chapter 24, verses 36 through 44, Jesus says, "But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For in the days before the flood, there were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and didn't know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be." There in verses 40 through 43, he describes what we call the rapture. Now, you don't find that word rapture anywhere in the Bible, but it's what we call the rapture. And in verse 44, he says, "Therefore you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming in an hour that you don't expect." Let me tell you something. I am thoroughly convinced, at least here in the United States, that very few, if anyone, is looking for the coming of the Lord. If they were, they wouldn't be acting like they're acting. They wouldn't be treating people the way they're treating people, and they wouldn't be allowing the things to happen that are happening in our country today. Are you ready? You know, Matthew chapter 25, the first 13 verses, he gives a parable of the 10 virgins, Jesus does. 5 were ready with their lamps full of oil, waiting for the groom, and 5 weren't ready. When the bridegroom came for his bride, only 5 were ready and were taken. When the others asked to come in, he said in verse 12 and 13, "I say to you, I don't know you. Watch therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour in which the Son of Man's coming." I think a lot of people are going to be like the 5 brides. They weren't ready. Let me ask you, will you be caught sleeping? It's a time of decision for you. Make a decision for him today. Choose Jesus today. Follow him. Commit your life to him. By the way, he's the only one that knows the future, and he only wants good for you. So what have you got to lose if you give yourself to him and follow him? Well, not only was the time short and the team were sleeping, but the tenderness was a sham. Now, what I'm talking about is the kiss there in verse 49. It's a token of affection, but it's not true love. You see, his love, Judas's love, was for money. In verse 15-16, Judas says, "What are you willing to give me to deliver him to you?" And they counted out 30 pieces of silver. That's the price of a common slave. So from that time, he sought opportunity to betray Jesus. You see, Judas was greedy. In verse 7 and also in verse 9, it says a woman came to him having an alabaster flask, very costly fragrant oil, and she poured it on Jesus' head. And he said it as he sat there at the table. And when his disciples saw it, they were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For this fragrance might have been sold for much and given to the poor." Then, in John chapter 12, verses 4 through 6, we see that Jesus said, "Why was this fragrance not sold for 300 denarii?" That's almost a year's wage. "And given to the poor." This he said not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. Jesus wasn't his God. Money was his God. In 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 10, it tells us, "For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, which some, having strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows." Have we true love? Jesus tells us in John 14:15, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Then in verses 23 and 24, he says, "If anyone loves me, he'll keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we'll come to him and make our home with him. He who doesn't love me doesn't keep my words. And the words which you hear isn't mine, but the Father's who sent me." And then in Matthew chapter 6, verse 24, Jesus says, "No man can serve two masters. He'll either hate the one and love the other, or else he'll hold to the one, despise the other. You can't serve God and mammon." And people have the thought that mammon is money, but it's not. Money's part of it. What he's really saying is you can't serve God and this world system the way the world thinks. You can't do that. You know, no one suspected Judas as being the one that would betray him. After all, he was a good church member. I mean, who do you elect as treasurer of your church? The probably the most honest, God-fearing person. But yet Judas was the treasurer. And by the way, when Jesus told them that one would betray him, they all said, "Is it I?" You see, they were all afraid it was him themselves. Let me say, you say, well, what does that have to do with anything? Just because you're a church member, or just because you hold an office in the church, like, you know, you teach a Sunday school class, that doesn't mean you're saved. Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23, Jesus says, "Not everyone that says to me, 'Lord, Lord,'" in other words, not everyone that calls me Lord, "will be saved. Not everyone that says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. In that day many will say to me, 'Lord, haven't we prophesied in your name?'" In other words, haven't we preached in your name? "Haven't we done many wonderful things in your name? Haven't we healed the sick? Haven't we prayed for people to be well? Haven't we built, haven't we built buildings for you?" and all this kind of stuff. And he says, "Then I'll say to them, 'Depart from me, you worker of iniquity. I never knew you.'" Just like he told the 5 virgins, "I don't know you." That word "knew" is the Greek word gnosko, which means to have an intimate relationship with you. And that's what he wants from us. Listen, it's time of a decision for you. You need to decide right now. You need to turn your heart and life over to Him right now, because you may not have another hour. You don't know. To have an intimate relationship with Him is what He wants. And you need to decide that that's what your life is going to consist of from now on. Now, I know this isn't my customary happy-go-lucky type sermon, but it's something that needed to be said. God gave me this to share with you. Now, what are you going to do about it? If you make a decision, or you need help making that decision, give me a call. Shoot me an email. My information's going to follow. And when you do, I promise you there'll be no pressure, but I'll simply guide you through what God says, or I will assist you in answering questions. Whatever you need. If I've offended you, I apologize. No, I don't. It's kind of like I've always heard said, if you got your toes stepped on, your feet were in the wrong place. If you want to talk to me about it, if you want to vent on me, if you want to let me know how I offended you and all this kind of stuff, well, give me a call. Shoot me an email. You know. Let me tell you, it's too serious to let go. And I care too much about you anyway. So I'd love to hear from you either way. Well, until next time, God bless. Amen.